For weeks, Daisy, the elephant, just wouldn't eat. She cried every single day, and honestly, the zookeepers were at their wits' end. They couldn't figure out what had caused this sudden change in her behavior. They were asking themselves, what can we do to help her? That was the question that haunted them, day in and day out, for a whole month. Daisy seemed completely withdrawn, barely even noticing what was going on around her. They were worried sick, thinking she was running out of time. You see, Daisy wasn't just any elephant. She was the heart and soul of the wildlife park, a real favorite with everyone. They saw her as a friend. She'd been there since she was a baby, and most of the staff had watched her grow up. Usually, Daisy was so playful. She'd even pull little pranks on the staff to keep them from leaving her to tend to other animals. Elephants are incredibly smart and emotional creatures, and seeing her so happy and affectionate was just heartwarming. But then, everything changed. Most days, she wouldn't touch her food or water, only taking a few bites after a lot of coaxing. It was so unlike her, this elephant who used to devour her meals, and the look in her eyes. It was just pure sadness, like she was grieving a huge loss. Some of the zookeepers had even seen her crying at odd times, and they were desperate to understand what was happening. They knew they had to do something, or Daisy would sink into a deep depression, one that might be impossible to pull her out of. The consequences were dire. She might even give up completely, retreat into herself, and starve to death. The caretakers realized they were out of their depth. In desperation, the park manager reached out to an old friend named Mike, begging for his help. Daisy was slipping away, and Mike was the only person he knew who could give her the support she needed. Thankfully, Mike agreed to come, and 2 days later, he arrived at the zoo. Mike was a professional, experienced with wildlife, especially elephants. But when he arrived, nothing had changed. Daisy was still motionless in her enclosure, listless, with no interest in food. "Daisy, it's me, Mike," he said softly, cautiously stepping closer. "Why are you causing them so much trouble?" he asked gently. Suddenly Daisy's ears twitched, and she turned her head towards the familiar voice. Even though she was weak from fasting, she managed to stand up and slowly walk towards him. This was the person she'd been waiting for. As she approached, Mike remembered the first time he'd met her. Daisy was just a year old when she arrived at the park, an orphan. Losing her mother so young had made her shy and timid. She didn't want to bond with anyone, especially humans, who she probably blamed for her mother's disappearance. Just as she was trying to adjust, the park brought in a new volunteer, 24-year-old Mike. He started as a volunteer, but he had big plans. He'd always dreamed of working with animals. He was enthusiastic about all kinds of species, but he had a real passion for wildlife conservation. He'd read and watched everything he could about the struggle to protect these animals in a changing world. He wanted to be their voice, to make a difference. Getting a volunteer position at the wildlife park was a dream come true. It was his first job, and he was determined to prove himself and hopefully get hired full-time. Soon after he started, he was assigned to work as an assistant to a caretaker, and he was told about Daisy and how they were struggling to get her to come out of her shell. Daisy's mother had been killed by... So, where were we? Yes, Daisy's mum. Tragically, she'd been killed by poachers, and, Daisy was just a baby. Imagine the psychological trauma she went through. It was heartbreaking. The team's mission was to make her feel safe, to help her trust again, to bond with her caretakers. It was crucial. If she didn't form those connections, she'd just wither away, completely isolated. But honestly, Mike didn't truly understand the depth of the challenge until he was standing right there, face to face with Daisy. She'd only take food from one specific caretaker, and if anyone else tried to touch her, she'd retreat into her shell. Forget about playing. She'd just lie there, motionless, like you didn't even exist. And when Mike tried to approach her, oh boy, she was not happy. She saw him as a complete stranger, someone she trusted even less than the others. Every single day, Mike faced the same resistance. It was a stark reminder of how deeply scarred she was by losing her mother. During his downtime, he wasn't just kicking back. He was devouring books, seeking advice from wildlife experts he'd met before coming to the park. He knew he couldn't force Daisy to accept him, but he could show her, every single day, how much he cared. A month after he started working with Daisy, Mike and the caretaker brought her meal to her enclosure. She ate, then immediately flopped down, waiting for them to leave. But this time, Mike asked if he could stay behind. It was his last task of the day, and he wanted to spend a few extra minutes with her before heading home. He found a log and sat down. You know, elephants are like us in a way. They're empathetic. They can sense emotions. They can interpret our voices. Mike was banking on Daisy's natural ability to connect with him, to break down the walls she'd built around herself. So he started talking to her. He talked about his day, about things happening around the park. There was no plan, no script. He just spoke from the heart, about whatever popped into his head. He noticed her ears twitching when he laughed, but otherwise, she didn't give any obvious signs that she was listening. After about half an hour, he said goodbye and went home. But this was just the beginning. From then on, after his work was done, he'd go back to Daisy and spend time with her. He took over bathing her, turning it into a time for them to bond, to learn about each other, to build trust. Days turned into weeks, and finally, Mike started seeing results. And you know, before we continue, if you're enjoying the story, please give us a like and subscribe. It really helps us out. Thanks. He noticed Daisy was starting to anticipate his visits. Her ears would perk up when she heard his voice. She'd watch him with growing curiosity and engagement. Bath time became her favorite part of the day, a time when she was most cooperative. One evening, Mike went to the enclosure, completely exhausted. He just wanted to go home. But he and Daisy had their routine, and he wasn't about to break it. He planned to stay for just a few minutes, apologize and leave. But when he arrived, he was met with a surprise. For the first time, Daisy was standing, waiting for him. As he sat down, she approached him cautiously, listening as he talked about his day and how amazed he was by her progress. But then, it was time to go. Before he could turn away, Daisy wrapped her trunk around his arm and tugged. Mike couldn't help but smile. Nearly 3 months had passed, and this was the first time she'd reached out to touch someone. He was deeply humbled, realizing he was the first to earn her trust and affection. The exhaustion vanished as he knelt down to pet her. This time, she didn't pull away. She held onto his hand, reassured that he wasn't leaving. When Mike told the manager and his supervisor, they didn't believe him, but when they saw it for themselves, they were stunned. As soon as Mike called her name, Daisy rushed to him. When he bent down to pet her, she nuzzled against him, showing affection and genuine happiness that she hadn't shown in so long. It was a beautiful moment. It was clear to everyone, watching the bond grow between Mike and Daisy, that something special was happening. So, the park decided to make it official. Mike became Daisy's primary caretaker, with some assistants to help him out. And with Mike's steady, loving care, Daisy blossomed. She became so much more cheerful, no longer shying away from human touch. She'd play with the staff, sometimes using her trunk to playfully block their way, causing everyone to burst into laughter. But, you know, even though she was friendly with everyone, she never fully opened up to anyone like she did with Mike. For Daisy, he was her first real friend, the one who pulled her back from the edge when she was retreating into her own world. Those quiet moments they shared at the end of the day, they meant everything to her. Mike's ability to connect with Daisy became well known, and soon, wildlife parks and sanctuaries with challenging animals were reaching out to him for help. It was a lot of attention, but Mike was grateful for the chance to pursue his lifelong dream. In his free time, he gave consultations to other centers, sharing his insights and learning new techniques for improving animal behavior and strengthening those crucial human-animal bonds. Even with his growing commitments, Mike never forgot his first love, Daisy. No matter how busy he was, he always made time for her. He also worked hard to help her build relationships with the other rescued elephants that joined the park. And as Daisy grew, Mike grew right alongside her, staying by her side for 30 years. By the time Daisy was 31, almost everyone had forgotten her difficult start. Her playful nature and affection for her caretakers and visitors made her a star at the park, a source of joy for so many. Now, at 53, Mike had achieved more than he ever imagined. He was involved in important wildlife preservation projects, familiar caretakers. They also have incredible memories and never forget those who cared for them. Mike felt terrible. He'd failed to anticipate how she would react to his absence. To Daisy, it was sudden, incomprehensible. She couldn't grasp that she might never see him again. She clung to him, refusing to let go, drawing tears from the staff. Daisy immediately perked up, and even as she moved, she kept her trunk wrapped around Mike, afraid he'd disappear. He knew he couldn't leave until she was okay. He fed her. But, even though he loved his work, he was ready for a change. He wanted to retire and travel, to continue helping wildlife around the world. He knew he and Daisy had a deep connection, but he also believed his assistant could continue his work with her. So, he decided to leave. Mike started gradually reducing the time he spent with Daisy, hoping to ease the transition. The park was heartbroken to see him go, trying to convince him to stay. But a month later, his resignation was accepted. Before leaving, he went to Daisy's enclosure to say goodbye. Daisy, thrilled to see him, just wanted to play, barely paying attention to his words. He decided to play with her instead, savoring those last moments. But when it was time to leave, he tried to slip away quietly, hoping she wouldn't notice. But as Daisy wrapped her trunk around him, he realized how wrong he was. Elephants, you see, can get depressed when they loseth her, and in her happiness, she sprayed him with water, making him laugh. He spent the entire day with her, until it was time to go home. With Mike's guidance, Daisy slowly regained her strength and spirit. In recognition of his dedication, the park offered him the role of manager, giving him flexible hours so he could stay close to Daisy and the other animals he loved. He accepted. Even though he wasn't directly responsible for Daisy anymore, he still made time for her. Soon, Daisy had a calf of her own, and the first thing she did was introduce it to Mike. It was clear she wanted her calf to bond with the man who had meant so much to her. No matter what, Daisy would never forget Mike's kindness and affection. She knew she had a friend for life. Did you enjoy this story? If you were in Mike's shoes, would you have given up traveling the world to stay with Daisy? Let us know in the comments below. If you liked the story, please subscribe and give us a like. Daisy now knew she had a friend for life. Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next video. Have a great day.